there's something going on out there. I think there's some things going on here. I think there are partnerships that have developed in community and neighborhood centers. This hospital is a part of that process. The school district's part of that process. The police department. Faith-based programs, projects are. So I think the community is becoming more responsive. Whether this will last or not, I don't know. But this is a wonderful trend to see the youth, a substantial decrease in the number of youth who are victims of violence. Still not very positive that the adult population, those 18 and beyond, a substantial increase.
Do you see trauma all around when this is your professional life?
There are a lot of positive trends going on. Part of the trauma that I see at times, and we talk about trauma, it's a pretty large term.
What does it mean? What does it mean to be traumatized? Or?
Well, the way I'm defining it by my job, it's those cases that I'm looking at that are related to child abuse, to the victims of stabbings, gunshot wounds, battered assault for assaults who've been battered, domestic violence. Those are the kinds of ways I define it in terms of my job. When I see that as part of an admission, that's the kind of case I would be involved with. There's also trauma, of course, related to those car accidents, those injuries, those kinds of things. There's a lot of emotional trauma that's associated with that too. But the ones that I provide the most intense intervention tend to be the child abuse cases where we're needing to protect the most vulnerable part of our population, youth, domestic violence, child abuse, victims of violence.
How do you protect workers from becoming clinically depressed or being emotionally impacted by the work that they do with children?
I think most people choose working in pediatrics and children because of our need, our desire, our want to protect and help youth. Where it comes into conflict is because there's a lot of empathy, compassion that goes with our care. And you don't want to take that out of the job. That's what makes us most effective as clinicians, as families are going through the most difficult parts of their lives with their child. So you don't want to take that out necessarily, but you do have to build in supports and ways of coping and managing. One of the things that we have to do in our own personal life is to make sure we do have an effective support system. We do have the right connections that can kind of help return and feed us at the same time. There are also parts of our system that allows us to, and matter of fact, we're encouraged to use supervision, co-workers, whatever, to debrief. Our psychiatry program and our chaplaincy program takes a lead in that and to debrief around cases that are extremely emotionally laden. So we have tried to put those things into place. And I think, as you learned this morning, taking care of the physical self as well. Making sure you're sleeping, you're eating, exercising, those kinds of things, although I don't do much of the exercising anymore. But the sleeping, the eating, recreating, spending quality time with your family, building up what's been kind of taken down from you.
I think Rochester's violence differs from Pittsburgh, Chicago, Detroit, Utah, New Mexico, Puerto Rico in any way? Is it a uniquely brand of American violence, or is it all the same?
I read the violence that occurs in Oakland and in Puerto Rico and in Chicago and in various other major cities. I don't know that we're much different than any other city. I think that from what I've seen, though, and know particularly of Chicago and Oakland, there's an entrenchment of some of the gangs, the super gangs, that appears to be a level of viciousness that is beyond what occurs in Rochester. I have to say there's some parts of what's been described in Chicago and Oakland as being very scary in a way. I don't know that we have that level of just viciousness and brutality. Although death is death and loss is loss. But there seems to be a different level of qualitative thing that's occurring in Chicago, I think.
I don't know a lot of social workers who have worked in the field for 30, 40, 50 years. I know some social workers who leave after 10 or 20 years because of compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma. So what is it that keeps you going? That at the end of the day, when you go home, you feel like that's a good day's work?
I think there are probably two ways I could answer. I think the first way is that I chose this profession to make a difference. I thought it was the one profession that uniquely fit who I was, that would allow me to make the kind of differences I needed to make. I grew up in the 60s, the 70s, when there was a lot of change in our society. So this, being a social worker, is consistent with that. It allows me to continue on to make a difference. I have chosen to make it on an individual basis, family by family, but the partnership that I also work with helps me to make it on a systemic basis as well. So I get reinforced and get rewards from doing those kinds of activities. Right now my focus is greatly on victims of violence. Prior to that it was shaken baby syndrome. So I can find little elements that I can make a change, not only individually but more on a broader sense as well. So I get a lot of feedback from that and reinforcement. And on the family basis itself, when you can provide the kind of services and resources that a family can come back and say thank you very much, whether it's the end of life issues or whether it's giving them a resource that allows them to take the next step in their life, in the life of that family. That's very reinforcing. And then the other thing is I guess, is my faith. I do have strong faith, and I'm an elder of the church and the like, so I'm very active in my faith, so that helps regenerate and ground me.
And you have a big family?
No. I have 3 kids, 19, 20, and 21. I have to keep remembering their ages, but 19, 20, and 21.
Are you able to speak with them about your work? Have you always been able to speak with them about your work, or how do you navigate your home life? They're older now.
Yeah.
Dr. Sharp has younger children. How do you decide what to share, what to take home, and what to leave at the hospital?
I have to be particularly careful because some of these things are very traumatic. I mean, not only to me, and I don't want them to be a part of that vicarious trauma and sharing it and taking on the trauma that I've been exposed to necessarily. So I try to say very little about many of the cases that I'm seeing, so they don't know a great deal. They may know that I'm involved with the Violence Project, or I'm doing a speaking engagement or whatever. They know those kinds of things, but I try to stay away from specific cases.
Is that challenging to do?
You sometimes want them to know that you're doing things that you think are important, but you don't want them to be a part of that trauma. You don't want to add to some of the life issues they're struggling with as young adults, 19, 20, and 21. I mean, they're in that very population that I'm working aggressively to try to help. So I try to be sensitive and careful about that.
And do they come to you for advice, your own kids? And guidance?
Sometimes. Many times, yeah. It's kind of cute. They kind of take turns sometimes. Okay, it's my turn to talk to Dad. It's kind of cute sometimes.
What would you like to see in 10 years? What will be different in Rochester if the program continues going in the direction that it is, and continues to strengthen? What do you imagine will be different in Rochester?
There needs to be no place in our community where violence is tolerated. In my mind, our minds, communities, neighborhoods need to rise and say, not in my neighborhood. Whether it's the drugs, the alcohol, guns, gun sales, whatever it is, neighborhoods in our mind need to rise up and say, not here. In 10 years, that would be my hope. And I think that can only occur when neighbors kind of help one another. And we're part of that neighborhood here at the hospital. When we can take that position, but also provide opportunities for people to get out of that lifestyle. That opportunity may be in terms of additional training, may be in terms of jobs, whatever it is. We need to provide opportunity to change. Not only to say stop, but here's another viable opportunity or option for you to pursue. And to make that readily available in the here and now, not to wait 2, 3 weeks, a month, 2 months, a year. That's just not acceptable either. So I think as systems, we have to learn how to work better together. But those systems have to include neighborhoods.
And if I were a young social worker, just coming out of graduate school, what would be your advice to me if I was interested in going into this area of violence and intervention and youth? What would be your advice to me as a young graduate?
I would say that the kind of problems that you're going to encounter, at least I view them as possibilities we encounter. So that means it's taken a long time for our communities to become as they are, and it's going to take a long time for them to change, evolve, and to move into something more positive. So to keep your expectations well-grounded, these things are not going to change overnight. And that's one of the things I think is most disturbing is that when you see a particularly tragic loss of life, communities get up in arms and everybody appears to be so upset, and we go through a ritual. But then, 2 or 3 weeks later, it's almost as if it's been forgotten. And we go back to the same routine, as if it's acceptable for that to happen. I think we have to keep stirring the pot. That fervor doesn't get squashed in 2 or 3 weeks, that it remains high, it remains intense.
Do you think people can sustain that level of fervor? Is it emotionally, in a human capacity, possible to sustain that level of anger response, sadness? Is it possible for people to sustain that, or do they have to get on with life as a survival mechanism?
I think people choose to do the survival approach, and I think the danger in that is that when we do nothing, it almost says this type of lifestyle is acceptable. One of the things that I get from my group, our partnership, is we meet on a monthly basis, and we've been doing this for almost 8 years now. There are times when I also am emotionally exhausted and drained. The violence portion of my job is only a small portion of it. I see many other kinds of cases. So there are days when I come to these meetings that I am very, very tired, just emotionally kind of worn down. But when I step in a room and I find other people who have the same passion to stop them. So, in isolation, yes, you can't maintain. But when you're with a group of people who share that same passion, the same energy, it can kind of help lift you up, focus you, and you can kind of look at some goals that you can target and reach.